Welcome to the Safety Up podcast. We support developing a safer, sustainable workplace. Today, we'll introduce operational excellence. Industrial leaders strive for operational excellence in productivity, quality, and safety. Today's leaders recognize that achieving operational excellence requires a workforce that is safe, healthy, and engaged in the organization's mission. In top-performing companies, the safety of employees, suppliers, and contractors is a value that makes efforts to reduce injury and illness a top priority. Companies striving for operational excellence understand that productivity, quality, and safety are inextricably linked.
Mikey, can I ask you questions?
Sure.
I've heard people say, safety is number one, and then say, quality is number one. No one has to say it, but I know production must also be number one. Is safety in competition with quality and production?
No. Think about a perfect manufacturing world that does not exist. In this perfect world, production lines would produce 100% first-time quality with no unplanned downtime or breakdowns. In this non-existent world, employees would not have to enter machines and equipment to get things running, fix quality problems, etc. These situations create the highest risk to workers. When you improve production and quality, you improve safety. This is operational excellence.
Can you explain the attributes of organizations striving for operational excellence?
At its core, leaders must communicate that problems are good things if eliminated or reduced. Much of this podcast series is based on the teachings of Dr. W. Edwards Deming and how those philosophies helped Toyota develop its vaunted Toyota production system.
Why would having problems be a good thing? Don't we want perfection?
Perfection does not exist, nor does zero risk. Leaders must create a culture of trust and respect where workers feel free to raise concerns and issues, especially when safety policies or procedures hinder their work. Toyota's scientist, Taiichi Ono, was known to say, having no problems is the biggest problem of all.
How does this link with continuous improvement?
Great question. A solution does not need to solve the problem 100%. Solutions must stay in effect until a new, more permanent solution is agreed upon. This is the process of continuous improvement.
What is the goal of continuous improvement and operational excellence?
Always strive for zero waste. Waste is operational, environmental, and human waste. We will never attain the goal, but that is the target.
How do I go about eliminating waste?
A safety incident is a waste. This podcast series will walk you through the steps to improve occupational safety and health.
What is the goal of improved occupational safety and health?
The goal of occupational safety and health is to reduce injury and illness. It is not only a legal requirement enforced by the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, OSHA, but good employers know that an engaged workforce is one where management demonstrates we care and employees feel safe.
Is the result having no risk in the workplace?
Safe is a relative term because zero risk does not exist. Within this context, the focus of this podcast series is the attainment of acceptable risk. The foreword to ANSI B11 2023, Safety of Machinery, which is aligned with ISO 12100, offers the following. Safe is the state of being protected from recognized hazards that are likely to cause physical harm. There is no such thing as being absolutely safe, or in other words, a complete absence of risk. In turn, there is no machine that is absolutely safe. All machinery contains hazards and some level of residual risk. However, the risk associated with those hazards should be reduced to an acceptable level.
How do we ensure our workers' tasks are performed with an acceptable level of risk?
Identifying hazards and implementing mitigation measures to reduce the risk of injury or illness are the basics for a safer workplace. It is important to have an organization that demonstrates respect for people and a culture of continuous improvement. Fortunately, those mesh well with lean thinking, which recognizes the integration of production, quality, and safety as inseparable goals.
What is lean thinking?
Lean is a term first used in the 1990 book The Machine That Changed the World, describing the Toyota production system as lean manufacturing. Lean thinking is the application of Toyota fundamentals to solving any kind of problem. Before the term lean came into being, Toyota merely developed a suite of tools and thinking as they attempted to follow the teachings of Dr. W. Edwards Deming. You will learn more about Deming and lean thinking in the next podcast.
How does Deming and lean thinking apply to the identification and mitigation of risks?
Risk identification and risk reduction pose challenges. This podcast series attempts to combine existing programs and initiatives while always returning the listener to the basics of risk identification and feasible risk reduction. The foundations of respect for workers and using PDCA for continuous improvement are woven into the fabric of this podcast. Let's begin with risk identification.
Can you give me an idea of how to begin the process of risk identification?
Sure, the hazards of machine motion, working from heights, confined spaces, noise, etc., are all easily identifiable hazards that can lead to injury or illness.
What is the difference between an injury and an illness?
The main difference is the cause and nature of the condition. Illnesses can be caused by infections, exposure to harmful substances, or genetic predispositions. They can be acute or chronic, including skin diseases, respiratory disorders, or hearing loss. An injury typically results from an accident, fall, or other sudden incident. Injuries can include cuts, scrapes, scratches, fractures, sprains, amputations, and death.
What does OSHA say about hazard identification?
The Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission was established by Congress when the OSHA Act was passed in 1970. This commission hears cases contested by employers or OSHA. The 2015 OSHRC Review Commission docket number 13-1124, Secretary V. Integra Health noted, Commissioner Sullivan ascribes to a reasonable foreseeability test because any practice or condition which is unforeseeable cannot be prevented. An employer cannot render a workplace, therefore, free of a recognized hazard if the hazard is unforeseeable.
If I am compliant with OSHA, does that mean I will have a workplace free of recognized hazards?
OSHA compliance is necessary because it is the law and the legal standard of care for employers. However, the fact that it is necessary does not make it sufficient to identify exposures that could lead to serious injuries or fatalities. Please explain why compliance is necessary but not sufficient. Serious injury and fatality exposures are typically related to very low probability but high severity events. Studying OSHA, recordable cases, and other minor injury causes will not proactively identify such exposures.
Isn't hazard identification relatively straightforward?
Yes and no. The open and obvious hazards I mentioned are well known and easily identifiable. However, there may be exposures created by unknown factors. As we'll discuss in the following podcast, identification requires the input of factory floor workers who will talk openly about issues and where existing safety policies may not work in the real world. That kind of open discussion will only occur in an environment of trust.
Do I understand that you will tell me more in the next podcast?
Yes, identification involves dealing with known unknowns. Unknown unknowns are more of a challenge. Remember that this is only an introduction and intended to give you an overview of the entire series so that listeners have a better idea of the context of each topic. The next podcast is designed to give listeners a more in-depth understanding of how to use practical methods to identify hazardous situations not identified by traditional means.
Okay. Once I have identified a potential high risk, what should I do next?
Next is the feasible application of the hazard control hierarchy, also known as the hierarchy of controls.
That's two topics, neither of which is familiar to me. Can you explain?
Let's start with the hazard control hierarchy. The hazard control hierarchy, also called the hierarchy of controls, is the preferred approach to mitigating risk. The hierarchy is comprised of 6 steps, which are often referred to as the higher order and lower order controls. Higher order controls include hazard elimination, substitution, and engineering controls. Lower order controls include warnings, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment.
How do I apply the hierarchy?
The hierarchy provides a systematic way to determine the most effective and feasible method to reduce the risk associated with a hazard. When controlling a hazard, the organization should consider methods to eliminate the hazard or substitute a less hazardous method or process. This is best accomplished in the concept and design phases of any project.
What if my workers or management claim a proposed risk reduction measure if not practicable for use?
If a proposed risk reduction measure is not practicable or feasible, a combination of controls should be considered. OSHA and the legal system use feasible, which is why we will use the term in this podcast series. The process of determining a feasible risk mitigation method continues down the hierarchy until the highest level feasible control or combination of controls is found.
Can you explain further how feasibility ties into the hazard control hierarchy?
Unless you can eliminate a hazard, you will typically have a combination of controls. Let's say that it's infeasible to move an air filter 8 feet in the air on top of a machine to the ground level because of space constraints. In such a case, you might consider having stairs and a work platform to perform the tasks of changing filters and other maintenance. If that's not feasible, you'll have to have fall hazard control in effect. That will require warnings to employees on fall hazards, training, other administrative controls, and PPE or personal protective equipment.
Can I measure feasibility?
Feasibility is a qualitative assessment using a combination of criteria offered by both OSHA and the ANSI standards. We'll also cover that in its own podcast. For now, just remember that feasibility analysis is a method of assessing the practicability of a proposed risk reduction measure. Listeners will find that the phrase, feasibility is your friend, has real meaning.
This seems really complicated with lots of things to learn and implement. Is the learning for this sequential?
Like many new things, injury and illness reduction can seem overwhelming. We endeavor always to put things in perspective, take it a step at a time, and not use any more technical terms than is necessary for the listener to absorb. This is truly a journey. If you want a typical program designed for specific goals, targets, and deadlines, this podcast series is not for you. If you want true culture change based on respect for people and continuous improvement, then you may find the Safety Up podcast to be right up your alley.
My bosses want targets and deadlines. Why can't I learn from this series and develop a program with deadlines and specific targets?
After the future podcast on Deming principles, respect for people, and lean thinking, we'll delve into the challenges of identifying hazardous situations that fall under the categories of known unknowns and the far more difficult issue of unknown unknowns. We can't explain how to get to those unknowns until you have more foundation and are willing to let this new thinking soak into the thinking of your management and workers. Thanks for tuning in to this episode by Safety Up. Today we covered an introduction to operational excellence. Next, we'll explore the lean thinking, foundations of continuous improvement thinking based on Dr. Deming's philosophies. The great news is that these principles were the foundations for the vaunted Toyota production system. You will find that the principles of managing production goals, quality, and safety are the same. This thinking is a cornerstone for developing a culture of operational excellence. You can support us by clicking like and subscribe. Take care, everyone, and until next time.